This recording is copyrighted by Marvin Oka and Grant Susalu 2012 and is licensed and released under the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 Unported license. This recording is freely released for any personal use, including duplication and sharing in its entirety, and provided that it is not used for commercial sale or used in any context other than the educational context within which it was created, and that credit of its authorship is attributed to the copyright owners, with links back to the website www.mbraining.com. Please note that this recording is intended for educational purposes only and is not rendering any medical, psychological, financial, legal, or other professional advice. Any personal actions taken based on this recording is at the sole discretion and responsibility of the listener.
Hello and welcome to this audio recording on mBit. My name is Marvin Oka, and along with my colleague, Grant Susalu, we are the co-developers of the emerging field of multiple brain integration techniques, or mBit for short, as well as being the co-authors of the book mBraining, Using Your Multiple Brains to Do Cool Stuff.
And hi, I'm Grant Susalu. Did you know the latest research findings in neuroscience have shown that we all have three complex and functional brains, one in our head, one in our heart, and one in our gut? Our book, which Marvin's just mentioned, mBraining, describes the scientific evidence for this as well as a suite of powerful yet practical methods for harnessing the capacities of your three brains to achieve greater wisdom in your daily decisions and in your actions. With mBit, you can live more fully, more powerfully, and much more joyfully than ever before.
We're talking today with Dr. Stephanie Burns. Stephanie is a well-known expert in the field of accelerated learning, with a strong following in the corporate, education, and government communities. Originally trained as an engineer by the US Army, her career evolved through influential studies into human behavior, and her work is now found embedded in many international education programs. For the past 25 years, Stephanie has built a global reputation as a leader in adult learning, tens of thousands of people having attended her excellent Learning to Learn and Training to Train programs. She's the author of 3 books, Great Lies We Live By, Artistry in Training, and Move Closer, Stay Longer. Stephanie completed her PhD on the role of emotion in the learning process and has spent 10 years developing and running a series of successful online learning programs.
Well, it's a pleasure today to be talking with Stephanie Burns, a good close colleague and friend that I've known for almost 30 years now. How about that, Steph?
I can hardly believe it.
I know.
It seems like yesterday, Marvin.
Yeah, in some ways it seems like yesterday. In other ways it seems like a lifetime as well. But it's fabulous being able to talk with Steph again, and a world-renowned expert and authority in the world of learning and understanding how people learn. And she has some marvelous programs out, her Learning to Learn program. She's a pioneer and innovator in the world of learning and what becomes possible. So Grant and I are very excited to speak with her today. So Steph, for our listeners, give us a quick background and overview of the work that you do.
Oh, okay. Quick, huh?
Yeah.
Yes. No, I think you said it all. I mean, certainly my later career has, later being the last, 25, 30 years, has really focused on kind of the phenomenon of adults when they engage in a learning process. I was quite fascinated as a young instructor in the military at the range of behavior that my students exhibited, most of which didn't have a lot to do with being effective as learners, but had a lot to do with protecting themselves emotionally and not wanting to fail or not wanting to look foolish in front of their peers, not wanting to ask questions for that reason, making up answers, hoping they could get by, mumbling their way through an answer, hoping I would just give them the answer in return, et cetera, et cetera. So I was quite enamored with this whole kind of process or play that used to undertake every time I stood up to teach adults. And that really led me to want to focus my academic studies in that direction. And I've pretty much been involved in that ever since. And it's really come in 2 directions. One, trying to understand the nature of learning for adults who have an adult brain. They're no longer children. They have a great capacity, a far better capacity for learning, I find, than children ever did. Unfortunately, they don't demonstrate that because they keep applying the same learning strategies they had when they were 6 and 7 years old in school. So without some sort of re-education to basically use better strategies, they were going to always and forever be stuck learning like children do, which is quite slow and arduous. So a lot of my work focused on developing those strategies, giving adults an opportunity to reevaluate what school had been and giving them some evidence of really the power they have as learners. The second side of that, of course, is looking at what teachers are doing in the context of adult learning. Teachers also come from that particular world, the world of school, and so they're teaching methods and styles. Their expectations oftentimes harken back to what they saw their teachers doing to them in school. So, the combination of adults not being able to be more responsible for their own learning and teachers not knowing necessarily how to help them in that process became quite problematic. And we found most adult learning programs produced extremely poor outcomes for the students. And the third area that really became interesting was the actual methodology being used. And again, adults require a different methodology for teaching, and I think some of the best work I saw in that area was Michel Thomas's work in foreign languages, and now the research that's been done on his methodology, I would say, probably as closely matches what I'm doing as anything I've found. So so those three prongs have kind of driven everything, and in every context. So I guess in the short story is it's enabled me to work with students of all types, be it corporate, in the education area, academic field, government, etc. I've worked with school teachers, corporate trainers, coaches, managers, leaders, and as far as methodology goes, that's been everything from not only face-to-face methods, but then on from that, looking at online teaching methods and how do we engage students in media, be that via written media, audio, video, and of course today in the online world. So that's that. And today I really don't do any of that anymore. So that was really just the past. But I'm still keenly interested in the subjects, and I do poke my head out in the community every now and again to do something. But at the moment, I'm kind of back in the learning box myself. It was always, if I'd had another career opportunity to start over again, I would have gone straight into music, which an opportunity didn't arrive for me when I was younger. So being I have the time, I think, and the energy for it, I pretty much am studying full time again. And of course, that all brings everything back to life, but in my own skin and in my own process. So that's me, I'm just hunkered in, pretending I'm a teenager again with my guitar in my bedroom.
That sounds fantastic.
I finally grew up to be the teenager I always wanted to be.
That's a great aspiration, I think. My heart resounds with that, Steph.
Get to do it all over again. You have 40 more years, imagine. I keep hearing people saying, if only I knew then what I know now. Well, if you got 40 more years, you can say, yeah, well, I do know now, so what would I do with those 40 years? And you can start choosing again, for sure.
Brilliant. So many places to go from that. There's a lot of directions I can work on. I'll start with an easy transition one here. So as you're learning more, as you're going back to your student mode and learning music, what kinds of new learning strategies are you applying? Perhaps differently than you would have before you've learned about learning.
Oh, geez. Probably everything. I mean, everything from certainly pace and timing in a day, and how much can be done. I would have been a kid who would have spent 10 hours in repetition on something and then after 3 months wondered why I was actually getting worse at what I was trying to learn. Today I really know the value of being able to focus attention fully for short periods of time. I understand get in, make a change, a small measurable change, and then stop. Like stopping is such a critical part of learning. The brain needs time to integrate what's just happened. That whole notion of measurable change has been, critical for me. So when I go into an activity, I have a pretty clear outcome what it is I'm trying to do. And those changes are necessarily very small. I mean, we can be talking a millimeter more, a second faster, 1 beat a minute faster, for 2.5 minutes instead of 2 minutes, 20 seconds. I mean, these changes are really small. But one of the things I recognize certainly is, engaged in a lot of learning processes is that anything that requires high skilling and training within the nervous system is done a little bit over an extremely long period of time. And the only way I've ever learned to shorten that up is to actually go slow. Go slow to go fast, but make absolutely every effort be meaningful in some sort of measurable way. Nothing would have frustrated me more in music, had I done it at an earlier age, then year after year after year of lots of time, but no actual significant change. And today I can literally go to bed every night being able to measure some change in my skill in the direction of the goals I'm trying to go in. So I think, it's that whole management of the process. I would also say I don't sweat the small stuff. I understand that learning is arduous, it's difficult. Back in the old days, it certainly would have seemed that if I wasn't having fun, then I should be doing something else. Today, I just recognize that it really is an anxiety-provoking, a frustrating, sometimes boring process that has to be endured to get where you want to go. So my tolerances for those kind of emotional responses in learning is very high at this point. So I tend not to be. So I just tend not to quit at times when I probably in earlier days would have quit. I guess the last thing I'd say is knowing how to seek out the single best teachers that suit my nature and my style for learning. So, in the early days, I just wouldn't have had the distinctions, and it was very easy then to spend, an incredible amount of time and even money, sometimes many years with a teacher who indeed their methodology was what was problematic. So I'm able to choose, pick and choose more wisely who I allow in that learning environment and what my expectations of them are. And I also have the skills to make them be a very good teacher for me. So they may not be a good teacher for anyone else, but I know how to get the best out of them for my own best benefit in the process. So, we could talk about that, all of these kind of things for an hour, because there are so many things I'm doing now I wouldn't have had a clue to do back then. But those are certainly the ones that come off the top of my head.
So, Steph, I'd like to jump in just there with a question that you've triggered from what you've just said about the anxiety of the learning process. You were mentioning it. My question's around the process of cognitive dissonance and the use of that in maximizing learning. The idea that sometimes that anxiety can actually motivate you and drive you at both a heart and gut level to really want to continue learning, or it can demotivate you. It can add to the the memory and learning process, or it can take away from it. What's your understandings and your recommendations around managing that aspect of accelerating your learning?
Well, for me, anxiety, I think you're right. Anxiety can certainly drive people away from the learning process. It causes them to they want to remove that sensation, that physical sensation or visceral sensation, and the single best way to do it is to stop doing whatever they're doing that's causing it. So if it's a learning task that they're engaged in that's causing it, stopping is the way to go. Of course, that interferes tremendously with the learning process. And that, of course, then sets them up later when they go back to the same task or are thinking about going back to the same task, because they trigger the same emotional response in anticipation of the task. Now you have chronic procrastination and avoidance of learning tasks. So certainly anxiety can be negative. For me, solving that and seeing it as a positive is just basically recognizing it is the way it is. Learning is, of its nature, arduous and highly problematic. It is far more negative than it is positive, an experience to be engaged in. Where the positives come in are, the little wins you get on a day. Again, having a measurable result on the day. I might work for an hour and be absolutely over it. It's just so challenging and difficult. But as soon as I get that breakthrough, I can tell you what, I am high as a kite. So for me, it's recognizing that the nature of learning is difficult. And knowing that allows my mind to say things like, boredom is not a good enough reason to stop. Of course you're going to be anxious. It's only the third time you've ever done it in your life. It's like that kind of rationalization comes in because I recognize I can't make the learning fun when it's not. But what I can do is I can accept it being what it is and recognizing it's only for a period of time. The first 3 months will be challenging, or the first 5 times I perform on stage will provoke incredible stage fright or anxiety. But I expect these things will kind of, neutralize somewhat to a more manageable state later, and only if I stick with it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I wonder, in listening to you saying that, how do you manage the holding, the ultimate goal, the learning goal? To my mind, and in my own strategy, I tend to then focus, especially from an mBit perspective, and really focusing in my heart on the ultimate goal of what I'm attempting to achieve. I just wondered whether that was, because it sounds very much like that's what you were kind of intuiting or unconsciously saying, is that you push through the anxiety-provoking or the boredom-provoking aspects of having to just do the grist for the mill, because you've got that larger goal in mind. If you didn't have that to motivate yourself, you would, like you said, some people just stop.
Listen, I think that that's true at times, and it can be very motivating. But I'll add to that. So I think you're right. When the larger goal you have an absolute passion for and a drive to want to succeed, it can definitely aid in. It doesn't change the feelings in the moment you have, but it certainly can cause persistence. I will say, however, long-term goals can also not be compelling enough to do that. So the thought that if I wake up every single day and do this challenging thing, in 5 years I'll be able to do something else, it's just so far away that is very, very hard to keep that in mind. The other thing is you absolutely have no knowingness in the present about the qualities you'll have in the future. So you might have a goal to achieve something that's substantial, but it's only going to be through action that you actually find out what you've got there, whether or not you have the requisite skills or talent or even desire for it. It's just so funny that we head down these paths with these ideas of things we want to do, and experience then turns up and says, I really hate doing this stuff. That was kind of like me with teaching. I was really compelled. I could travel the world. I could meet all these people. It was only in the doing of that I learned that I really don't like doing any of those things. So the bigger goal you can have as an idea, and I would use it anytime it is compelling, but I wouldn't expect it to be always compelling. I mean, we even see this in ways, around, for example, people doing health goals or fitness goals or weight loss goals. I mean, they can have incredible incentive in achieving the goal, like not having diabetes or being able to walk up the stairs or being able to go outside and play with your kids. You would think those long-term goals were compelling enough to get them to do something today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day to do something about it. And we all know how that goes. There's just the immediate moment tends to be, for me, where the power of the motivation is. So I, yes, have some long-term kind of goals that are a bit vague because I just don't know where this is going to go. But more importantly, I love the day-to-day activity of it, so I quite enjoy putting in the time. I am extremely present with it, so I'm really looking for measurable change only in that particular session. And I just figure if I do enough of them over enough years, eventually I'm going to get somewhere. So that's motivating for me. So yes, I'm much more present focused. I would say that the long-term goal of where this may go is I might spend several months not thinking about it. And so to get the interesting side here, because I decided when I went back to music, I said, well, what would I have done at 18? The first thought I had was I would go to school. I would do this formally. I would formally go to the single best music college I could get into. And that would mean for those 4 years, I would have to study. And that meant for those 4 years, I wouldn't even have to think about what I wanted to do with this. I could just focus on the development of my skills and make the decisions about what did I like, not like, what interested me, what direction did I want to go. I could make that decision much later in the game. Now, I'm just at the end of a 3.5-year master's program, which I finish in June, and I had just I just put a big X at the end of June 2013 and said, when I wake up on that day is the first day I will begin to think about whether I want to do anything with this or not. Because it'll be the first day I feel like I've come through an education process enabling me to make some sort of wise decision. I didn't want to prematurely decide to perform or in a particular genre because I figured how limiting. And in 2 years I'd be waking up going, okay, well, I've done that. Now what do I want to do? And that for me was not a long enough or a compelling enough goal. So I don't know if that adds anything, but so I don't want to say it doesn't. I just want to say that it can be limiting to only have that. And by no means is a long-term goal that really benefits you, significant enough to get you out of bed to do something about it today.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you've said. And in listening to what you said from an mBit perspective, what I heard you talking about was that you focused on the things that you loved about the process rather than the long-term goal. The long-term goal was there, but it was really, you started describing the things you loved, and from a neural syntax modeling perspective, we would be saying that would be something you'd be focusing in your heart on, which would be, in your heart, you enjoyed some of the day-to-day processes, even though some of the other parts of the learning weren't. So boredom is also something that you feel in your heart. So, there's aspects that I think you were talking the difference between, like, certainly the weight loss things. People know cognitively in their head that they need to stop doing some of their behaviors because it's creating diabetes, etc. But they haven't integrated that across the heart, gut, and head level. So it's just a head goal. When you only have a head goal, it's very easy for your head to think different thoughts. So you get, sit in what NLP, we call sequential incongruity. So, if I were modeling from an mBit perspective, what your learning strategies there, I'd be saying to people, find something that in what you need to learn that actually you can hook into, and not necessarily for some people the end goal might be compelling enough. For others, it's find something every day that you enjoy in this process so you can keep doing it every day. Would that be a fair summary?
And that enjoyment can just be putting a tick on the box that I did another day.
Yeah, exactly.
Write in my journal that I spent 10 more minutes. That's 10 minutes less than I have to do in the future. I mean, it's amazing how much pain I will endure just to put another tick on a box. So I don't go to bed when I don't have another tick on the box. That would annoy me more. So don't forget, with emotional valence or significance, these are things constantly being weighed up in the decisions we make. So the pain, for example, or my imagined discomfort doing a task, when that gets on the scale with how bad am I going to feel when I go to bed tonight having done nothing, the going to bed having done nothing is far more negative to me than the actual action I have to take to satisfy that. So both are negative. It's just one's worse. So it's and that's another interesting trick in learning strategies is and I got this probably from you, Marvin, way back then, is really always looking at what's worse than what I'm actually asking myself to do. I mean, I wrote my PhD thesis on the agreement that if I didn't write for an hour in the morning, I would go and garden for an hour that day. And in 4 years or 3 years of writing, I never gardened. So I hate gardening, hate it.
And I'm taking that you don't enjoy gardening.
No, it's dirty and it's hot and it's awful. And in the winter, it's really bad. Like, all I had to do is think about, if you don't sit here and write for an hour, you have to go garden. And I would sit and write for an hour. And I hated the writing process in that PhD process. It was just really, really difficult. So worst case choices are really a good, valuable strategy. What would I rather be doing less?
That's fabulous. That's great.
Sorry, are we making you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking. So, Stephanie, it seems that obviously at the core of learning is our adaptive neural networks start forming new patterns.
Yes.
They start patterning and repatterning. And as you're well aware, as we're saying with mBit, that neuroscience has found that we've got not just a head-brain set of neural networks, but also in the heart and the gut. And obviously, as adaptive neural networks, the heart can learn, can store information, so can the gut. It can process. It has memory, and it's adaptable. So in the learning process, now when we now recognize we have at least 3 functioning neural networks. Yeah. From your perspective, what are the implications for that in how we go about understanding learning and teaching?
Yeah, I find this very interesting, and I think I read the book now a couple months ago, and I went back and reread it just recently, because it is an interesting concept. I can't quite get my head into a place that understands my gut in the learning or my heart learning, but I could see where it played a role in things like how I made my decisions about persisting or procrastinating, how I made my decisions about what activities to engage in a day. I could see that it was playing a role in the stories I was telling myself and stories I was telling others about my learning process, both past, present, happening now, or what I'm imagining in the future. So I found that all three of these seemed to want to inform the story in some way, and sometimes one was more dominant than another. I think I also found that in the learning process, this came up a lot in kind of my internal dialogue, both in how I command myself, things like, sometimes I just hear myself say, get your head in it, get your head straight, or, play that with your heart in your hands, or, geez, I have no taste for doing this stuff today. So I could hear this kind of dialogue in these kind of both declarations and also in commands. And so I found that these three brains and how they're communicating had mostly to do with decisions I was making about what I was doing, for how long I was going to do it, whether I would be persisting or whether I was going to be avoiding a task. So it seemed more that within me it came up. It definitely was playing a role in motivation across the board. And each of the three seemed to have something they wanted to say about that. Good days are when they were all kind of singing the same tune. Other days, I would rely on one being more right than the others. Like my head might be giving me all kinds of reasons to delay it till tomorrow, but my gut might be saying, yeah, but if, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The feeling is bad that tomorrow's going to be a better day. And I would defer to the brain or the source of information that seemed to get me to get the task done or get the task started. It was funny. I want to just backtrack for a second. What the book did for me was it really sensitized me, in my language, I would say it educated my ear for these kind of language patterns that the three brains are offering. So I became hypersensitive to any time I heard any linguistic either term, word, or phrase that kind of identified the source of the information. And I was getting this both sensitive to it in my internal dialogue. I was very sensitive to it when I was having conversations with others and when I was writing. And I also became very sensitive to this when I was listening to others describe their own experiences. So it was, that was the first step for me, was getting my ears to kind of hear a little bell every time one of these words or phrases were used. And then as I took that sensitivity into learning processes, again, I found a lot of it had to do with my decisions about what I was doing and for how long I was doing it. Sometimes they all agreed. Sometimes I went with the one that seemed to give me the best, most rational decision for sticking with it rather than quitting on the day.
Along those lines, one of the classic phrases people often use are things where they need to digest their learnings, or
Sure.
They need time to digest that. What's your sense of how that plays out in learning?
I think it's absolutely true. Whether it's the, how I'm perceiving this, and like I said, I don't have the expertise in it that you do. Remember when I said just earlier was that one of the significant parts of learning is having the wisdom to know when to stop. It's like recognizing that you've just gotten the wind, you've just gone, so your brain and body and nervous system has just created something you couldn't do before. And that integration, the time to build the network, to solidify it and rehearse that, is done better with you out of the way, meaning doing it more yourself physically is less useful than sitting down and asking your brain to work on that while you go about other tasks. You'll always come back to it better. So for me, when I think about digesting learning, that's essentially what I'm doing. I'm allowing the learning to be rehearsed and regurgitated and kicked on far more effectively than I could do if I were in a physical practice way. So is it that the gut brain is suggesting to me, like informing me that I need time, therefore, and that's where my little bell goes off going, okay, we need to stop here and give it that time. Is it my head that knows the logic of the breakthrough and taking the time? But all I'm saying is one of those three always seems to be informing me or asking me to pay attention. And you're right. I think if I got the line in my head that says, Jesus, it's time to go digest all that, I would be thinking, the gut brain is having a conversation with me at the moment. It's trying to give me something that it feels I need to do for my own best benefit in this process.
Yeah, just even in the way you've languaged some of that when you're saying you needed to, when you were reflecting on when you need to digest some learning, that as you said, you need to regurgitate or you need to kick on, which are all gut-brain
exactly
gut-brain language
Yep.
on this. And one of our principles in mBit is that true integration is a function of the gut brain. That real integration requires an incorporation into one's identity. And also you were mentioning earlier around, as Grant picked up as well, pushing through when you're feeling that anxiety. And often we can look at anxiety as an emotional aspect, but more often than not, it's a response to it's a fear response, which is going to be a gut brain response. Yep. And there's a couple of ways, obviously, people can push through. One is, as Grant was suggesting, we can tap into the heart brain and get motivation occurring in terms of valuing. And then there's also simply getting the gut to do, as he's saying, just got to do things so you can tick the box. For instance, there's a very popular health and exercise program that's happening here throughout Australia, and the person who runs this, one of her famous phrases is, you just got to get up and just do the exercise in the morning. Like, don't think, don't analyze it, just get up and do it. And it's primarily a gut brain motivation to just go into action.
Yeah.
And so similar in learning, it would seem that there's different ways that the different neural networks can play. So, for instance, at the start, as we're some of our listeners may be aware of the work of David Kolb and Bernice McCarthy, and certainly at the start of a organic learning sequence, they're suggesting that an adult learner needs to be motivated. And this is going to require some heart-brain activity. Then they go into the content, which requires the head to process some things. Then they go into actual practice, which requires the gut brain to do a few things. Then they go into the generalization of the learnings, which requires obviously all three brains. Do you have any thoughts or perspectives as to, or a bit more insight as to how all of this could play out?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. And again, as you noted, even in the questions you sent me, was that, this is it's not black and white. And my sense is all three of these brains are operating at all times. And we may be habituated to listening to one more over another, which is an interesting thought I had, was like how much do some people rely on, like act on the information from their gut brain, even though it's wrong half the time, for example. But it's just the way they do things because they feel it. Other people have habituated using their thinking or their head brain to analyze a situation all the time, chronically. It's become their way of making decisions. For me, this game, what I loved about this was I said, I think there's wisdom in recognizing all three have something to say about everything. And what are they all saying? And where are they congruent? Or which one may be identifying for me something that I would have not otherwise thought about or sensed in a decision I may be making. So I looked more kind of at an integration of that. But when I did go to that question and I started to pull these apart, I started to first think I saw this by saying, okay, well, if I look at this through the lens of an individual's unique preference in learning, which is how we used to look at this stuff. It was like that we had people for whom without the answer to the question why, just wouldn't engage in the learning process at all. So, or people who weren't going to get up and be able to be experimental and, take action or pull the thing apart and put it back together would not be motivated to learning. Meaning, so their own kind of single best way that they like to go about things would not be satisfied. And if you could say to them it would be satisfied, then you created in them a tolerance for doing the other things they didn't like understanding the what before they did the how, et cetera, et cetera. So when I think about, how you broke those out, I couldn't get clear lines, but I certainly could make sense that, the Y quadrant, if we link that quite strongly to things like the purpose for doing something, and if that purpose is strong enough, then yes, in the terms that you're using in mBit, then, you have a heart-brain connection happening there. And when we get into what, if we isolate what being content, declarative facts, the stuff you need to know that you would be studying in order to later put it into practice, then yes, I can absolutely see there being a strong connection to the head, thinking about that. When you got in the how, of course, that's practical application. There's, typically, which doesn't mean really you're up there physically doing something. Not all tasks require that, but certainly you're trying to seek patterns and connections. You're trying to map what you know in such a way that you can generalize and have flexibility to apply it. So I see the how as being lots to do with application. And I think, again, from the book, as you think about the heart and the gut brain, yes, I clearly can see an association there. And I think the last one, what if, is really the grand, it's not where everybody, don't forget all learning doesn't go to what if. Only certain types of mastery of a subject would require that. But when it does go in that direction, yes, I think there has to be a full integration. You have to know it to talk about it. You have to know it, like from your head. You have to know it from how to motivate other people to be interested in it. That would come from the heart. And you have to know it to be able to do it. Again, in your terms, you look at that from this, enteric system. So yeah, I mean, I could make a way to map all that over there. I think there's a real richness in continuing to pursue some of these kind of ideas. I think there's something to net out of further exploration of these concepts, both seeing all three brains informing all four quadrants, but one perhaps needing to be more dominant, or that the student should learn that in this, in that phase of coming to why you're doing something, that's critical to your motivation, and engaging the heart brain and listening to it dominantly, or educating it to lead in that process, could be really significant, a significant addition to the effectiveness of students. And when it gets into the what stuff, it's like getting the heart and the gut out of there. There's still going to be, you're going to get into what, and you're going to get that whole sensation. I don't feel like doing it. I just don't want to get on with it. I don't have a taste for this. This, disgusts me, whatever. And it's knowing that, well, great, they're talking, but that's not who you need to be listening to at the moment. It's all head. It's all rational. It's all get in, get it, and get out of there. So, I think there's something here, Marvin and Grant, for sure. I think it's an interesting concept.
That's great. Those are great. That's great insights there, actually.
I mean, I didn't have any experience where if I put in any activity I was doing, where if I asked the question, meaning put my full attention on the kinds of information those three brains, as you've described them, give me, that I couldn't find that they were informing me. That they always had something to say. I just found that in various activities, I allowed them to have, I didn't ever shut them off. I allowed them to have their say. And it was kind of like one of those silly things from back in the 80s, where you'd say, to your gut, well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. But we're going to stick with this. I know you don't feel like this. I know, but we're going to do this anyway. I found myself negotiating with them, so rather than being mindless and allowing them to drive my decisions, I just became hypersensitive to what they wanted to talk about. And sometimes they got their way and sometimes they didn't. And they all seem to be cooperating quite nicely now.
You're mentioning about different learning styles as well as what, the different, what we're learning obviously changes the learning strategies that are involved. And one of the things we facilitate in our trainings with mBit is that when the three brains get aligned, there's a generative learning that occurs that is epistemological, where their way of knowing the world, their way of creating their realities for themselves begin to evolve to a higher order of organization, as well as it's ontological. Their ways of being start to now transform, and it liberates a new form of expression when head, heart, and gut are aligned, and a more authentic way of doing oneself starts to now emerge. Do you have any insights with all your experience around not so much content learning, but more transformational learning for the person? What happens? What insights can you tell us about facilitating personal transformation?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because personal transformation, is just another form of learning. It just tends to be constructed with a lot of extra elements, from memories to values and beliefs and the stories we tell ourselves, how we've shaped memories, and how in a distorted way to support what it is we think is true today, and all that has to kind of get unpacked. So when you're doing personal development work, it can be kind of it's hard to find the clear path through that makes things make sense to people. And Lord knows I've been working on that for 30 years, trying to do that within my own life as well. So for me, where I think this has value, yes, I absolutely agree that, a breakthrough on a personal transformative level would certainly come when all three brains are congruent and, or as I would say in lay terms, singing the same tune in any given situation. So for example, when confronting a situation or confronting a decision, that there's a very quick and congruent way of responding and reacting. So the incongruence to me would mean that one day I'd do this and then the next day I'd go do something else. I'm confusing myself as well as everybody else around me. So I think we do start to look like we've gained wisdom. We look like we've gained some qualities of humanity when we exhibit consistency in our behavior. And I think the only way to be consistent is if we're consistently being given kind of a nod of approval and across those three systems. So I think teaching this, causing people to become acutely aware of of what the information from each of these sources sounds like, and resolving conflict between them would be an absolute incredible skill to give people. I mean, I've been looking at that myself. I mean, there's no week that goes by that I'm not confronting a decision where I'm hemming and hawing in I'm heading in two different directions. And I've had strategies in the past for playing out various scenarios so I could kind of tell what's what and make the best decision I could make. But, since reading your book, I first and foremost look for who in me is really happy about this and has its list of rationales and reasons, and then who in me is really kind of going, yes, but, and giving that part an opportunity to kind of get its message to me somehow. And I'm finding that it's really interesting. I almost feel like sometimes I'm having to sit my gut brain and my heart brain and my head brain on the table in front of me and have them do a negotiation. I feel like I've got a family meeting going on, allowing each of them to have something to say, their bit to say. And maybe the gut brain's giving me a big warning because it's triggering and reflecting on a past experience that's similar, that went really, pear-shaped, where my head is looking more at the future and the possible opportunities, and it's not paying any attention to the risks at all. And my heart might be doing something else. So it really has become, as silly as that might sound, as if I am putting them out there and allowing them to have a conversation that I'm observing. And then at the end of it, it's as if you had three advisors. You don't want them making your decision for you. But what you want to do is be able to get all the best information so you make the best informed decision. And you ask those for whom the decision has not gone their way that they've been appreciated. You thank them for what they've offered you. You want them to keep doing that job. That is their job. And in this instance, you're going in a particular direction. So do I think that plays into transformative personal development type learning in life? Absolutely. It's like you can almost start to think you could do therapy on yourself. And for how long we've said the only person you can't do therapy on is yourself because we're so bloody full of self-delusion. But by it's true. I mean, I'd be the first one to scream at somebody trying to analyze themselves. But this has almost given me a positional way to do it. And now I still could be blowing up smoke up my own backside on this, by the way. But I do feel clear I'm making decisions with more substance resting behind them. They're happening faster. One brain is not better than the other because that's all becomes context driven. and situational. They all seem to have their voices have an equal weight to me in some way. And when I say voice, I don't mean so much words, but the feeling tone of them is quite well. I would have said, more. I would have either been all head in some decisions, all gut in others, and my heart didn't really. I don't even think I had a heart, but I know I've got one now. Thank you, Marvin. I found my heart. Thank you. Tin Man.
I knew you had one.
I know, but nobody ever tells me these things.
Suddenly I feel like I'm in the Wizard of Oz.
I've had these really big breakthroughs in my life, and I would be sitting talking with someone like, a Diane McCann or something, and I'd be sharing with her my insight, and she would say things like, I knew that. And I would say, well, why didn't you tell me? She said, I thought you knew. No, I had no clue. So it's all learning. Like I said, the book is definitely the idea, the theory in the book is definitely added to my it's given me a few more arrows in my quiver when I'm observing learning processes. I'm doing a bit of coaching at the moment, and that has, tremendous personal development aspects to it. And it really is playing a role it's added a filter, for me to be able to make sense of things that I didn't possess before I read the book. And, for that reason, I've really appreciated it.
That's fabulous. I can see the time coming up, so maybe
I know. We might have to do a part 2.
We might.
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about.
That'd be great.
I didn't think I'd even get 5 minutes in, by the way, but we've done all right. And talking, when you got into the stuff around the sympathetic, parasympathetic systems, where are they useful, not useful in learning? So that led to all kinds of good thinking, and thinking about online stuff, that led to all kinds of things. Yeah. And you're right, we'll run out of time now.
I do want to talk, and so we do have to do another one. I wanted to talk about the whole autonomic mode, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and its role in learning, because it's crucial to be in slightly sympathetic versus parasympathetic for different aspects of the learning states and learning processes.
Yeah, no question. No question.
And the online stuff.
It just dealt directly with that. It dealt directly with emotion theory and the autonomic responses to an emotional to a trigger, an emotional stimulus, and the effect that had on then choices and decisions being made in the learning process. So that subject is very quite close to the work that I did for those 5 years with the university, and it's a great subject. It's and even the book Move Closer, Stay Longer deals with things that stimulate fear in a learning context, and and some kind of sensible ways of going toward that. So, and not letting fear get in the way of the learning process. So yes, there's a lot here. There's certainly more to be talked about if you'd like to be able to do that. If you'd like to do that.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, I think we can do that, and absolutely. And even going back to your gal who talked about, what she tells, the gal who works in the fitness industry, strategies come right off the back end of the PhD. They're right. Those were the critical conclusions that came out of there. So I think we can do a lot to help people who are in learning situations, specifically understanding it. And if you can language that in the context of mBit, I think, that's a real way to go.
Yeah. Sounds great.
So I'm happy to do that.
Cool. Now, this conversation is absolutely fascinating, and we're learning so much, and I see the time is starting to run out. So, Stephanie, if you'd be willing, would be great if we could have part 2 to our conversation, and we can continue on with some other topics.
Marvin, I'd really enjoy that. This has gone far, this has gone places I didn't expect it to go, and I'd really be happy to continue a conversation about it.
That's exciting. Terrific. Well, we'll schedule another time, and for listeners, be ready for part 2 for our conversations with the fantastic Stephanie Burns.
Ooh, thank you.
Thank you, Steph.
Thanks, Grant. Thank you both. Thanks, Marvin.
Thank you. Thanks, Steph.
This recording is copyrighted by Marvin Oka and Grant Susalu and is licensed and released under the Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 Unported License. This recording is freely released for any personal use, including duplication and sharing in its entirety, and provided that it is not used for commercial sale or used in any context other than the educational context within which it was created, and that credit of its authorship is attributed to the copyright owners, with links back to the website www.mbraining.com. Please note that this recording is intended for educational purposes only and is not rendering any medical, psychological, financial, legal, or other professional advice. Any personal actions taken based on this recording is at the sole discretion and responsibility of the listener.
Hello and welcome to this audio recording on mBit. My name is Marvin Oka, and along with my colleague, Grant Susalu, we are the co-developers of the emerging field of multiple brain integration techniques, or mBit for short, as well as being the co-authors of the book mBraining, Using Your Multiple Brains to Do Cool Stuff.
And hi, I'm Grant Susalu. Did you know the latest research findings in neuroscience have shown that we all have three complex and functional brains, one in our head, one in our heart, and one in our gut? Our book, which Marvin's just mentioned, mBraining, describes the scientific evidence for this as well as a suite of powerful yet practical methods for harnessing the capacities of your three brains to achieve greater wisdom in your daily decisions and in your actions. With mBit, you can live more fully, more powerfully, and much more joyfully than ever before.
Please note, this interview was recorded directly using web technology, and we apologise that there are occasional issues with the sound quality due to the nature of the internet service. We're talking today with Dr. Stephanie Burns. Stephanie is a well-known expert in the field of accelerated learning, with a strong following in the corporate, education, and government communities. Originally trained as an engineer by the US Army, her career evolved through influential studies into human behaviour, and her work is now found embedded in many international education programs. For the past 25 years, Stephanie has built a global reputation as a leader in adult learning, tens of thousands of people having attended her excellent Learning to Learn and Training to Train programs. She's the author of 3 books, Great Lies We Live By, Artistry in Training, and Move Closer, Stay Longer. Stephanie completed her PhD on the role of emotion in the learning process and has spent 10 years developing and running a series of successful online learning programs.
Well, we are here on part 2 with our conversation with Stephanie Burns, and we've got a lot to talk about. And for those of you that listened to our previous recording with Stephanie, there was just so much information there that we decided to have a part 2, and here we are. So, Stephanie, welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Marvin. Thanks, Grant.
Right, we've got so much to talk about. So, Stephanie, let's begin with your thesis. Could you give us a bit of an overview of the work that you've done on your particular thesis? Because there's a lot of overlaps with what you did as well as with mBraining.
Yes, we're discovering that, aren't we? Well, my thesis really was sparked by the concern that I had that once people had become re-skilled, if you will, in learning strategies, meaning they now possessed the strategies they needed to be effective learners, they had evidence for that. And, my hallucination always was that if people knew for a fact that if they pursued a goal, they would achieve it, then that's what they would go do. They would just go pursue their goals. But what I discovered over the years was that you could give people all of the kind of the self-efficacy and self-esteem and resources they needed to achieve something, but what it didn't do was it didn't get them out of bed to do anything. And I used to start thinking, you could give people everything they needed, and what would they do with that tomorrow? What they do is probably just stay in bed. And that was very frustrating for me. I felt that I'd somehow found a rather large gap in my understanding and teaching. And so that compelled me to start to want to look at this issue of motivation. And I started that first looking at all the ed-psych literature on motivation. And most of what I found from a psychological standpoint was interesting, but it didn't relate to my experience with actual students, nor the kind of narratives and stories they were telling me. So that I dove straight into that. I did the PhD because I wanted this to be more rigorously looked at. And I also knew that I was probably heading into a more hard science area. And for me, that felt like it was important to have some strict supervision on that. So what I did was I started to look at the numbers I was getting. I ran some surveys, and I found that between 75 and 85% of all the people who self-select a goal, be it personal or professional, regardless of how important the goal was or relevant the goal was, and regardless of the resources they had to achieve the goal, again, between 75 and 85% of the times, depending on the survey, those people failed to actually achieve the goal. And as soon as I saw numbers like 75, 85%, this is monstrous to me, and it was quite shocking. I immediately kind of cottoned on to the notion that it was more ordinary to quit a goal pursuit than it was to achieve one. It almost seemed like it was extraordinary for human beings to set a goal, pursue it and actually get to the end of it. So I wanted to find out more about that. And when I thought about this being rather ordinary for humans to quit, then I also started to think about this more in biological terms or physiological terms, meaning something was compelling humans in an extraordinary rate to fail to achieve or to stop pursuing the goal somewhere before the end hit. And sure enough, eventually this all led me into studying emotion theory, which was starting to get a lot of traction in the late 1990s. And we're having a very, very good understanding of what happens with humans as they engage in any activity and or imagine themselves engaging in activity, that all of those things are then given some sort of emotional weight or significance. We perceive in the same instant how we're going to feel doing that activity in the future or how we're feeling doing it in the moment. And as humans, like any organism, if the feelings are negative, be that emotional feelings or physical sensations that are negative, we tend to want to move away from those. And humans, of course, can make choices about that. So the line ultimately became, if what I'm doing doesn't feel good, then the message I have is to stop, or to stop doing whatever it is that's causing it, or to not start doing something that will cause it. Now, armed with that, we started to collect, thousands of pages of narratives of students or subjects, if you will, who were going through goal pursuits and analyzing those. And we found in many of the reports that people made about how they were feeling while doing something or how they thought they might feel tomorrow getting up to go do something, by and large, as many as 95% of the terms that were used in those reports were negative. And these would be terms emotionally like frustration, anxiety, boredom, apathy, etc. On a physical side, people would be reporting things like, their wrists hurt, the water was cold, their feet hurt, their legs were tired, their muscles were sore, etc. So all of these negatives led, and you could see it in the narrative, people to start to create stories and all kind of narratives that gave them a good enough reason to stop doing what it was they were doing. Like, tomorrow will be a better day, or I really hate my Mavis Beacon typing tutor program, or let's go do something else that looks constructive instead of what it is I'm supposed to be doing. And we could literally see these kind of strong emotions and physical sensations driving people to construct narratives to quit the goal. So that was my work. And of course, on from that, my subjects kind of followed the same trend. About 75% of them abandoned their self-selected goals before the end. But interestingly, we had a large number of people who actually persisted and completed the goals. And although my study wasn't about succeeding, it was about what was driving people to quit, did take that data and analyze it. And out of that data, we teased out 3 very consistent cognitive strategies that people use to override the instinct to quit, meaning boredom is not a good enough reason to quit. And once we had those 3, then, of course, the next question was, were they learned behaviors, which we found out they were, and therefore could they be taught to other people? And yes, they could. So my thesis kind of ran in that track and ultimately ended up teaching those strategies and really embedding those strategies in most things that I teach or in the online courses later on. So that's 5 years in a nutshell.
Well, that's fascinating work, and I'm glad you put in that last part because I was about to ask that question about those that did actually succeed and overcame just overcame negative emotions. And from an mBit perspective, we could look at it saying, well, there's a difference when the head narrative is being driven by an emotional state in the heart versus a values-driven state from the heart. Yes, it's quite different. So what did you find in terms of what makes the difference there between those that achieve and those that don't?
Well, what we found was it was how they controlled their thinking. For example, one of the core strategies, which you mentioned in tape 1, you mentioned there's a fitness program out there and there's a gal who's kind of harking on the notion that you just have to do it and not think about it. Well, that was absolutely one of them. And what we found is that there are individuals who know coming into a difficult task to disengage thinking about the task. So they don't think about it. They just do it. They just get started. So by disengaging thinking about the activity, they disengage the emotional calculation. So they don't See, if I sit here and I think, do I feel like going to the pool, and I get a big whopping image of that, and the emotional weight is that it's unpleasant, I have to find parking, the water's cold, et cetera, it doesn't feel good, I don't feel good about doing it, then I engage the brain to try to figure out how to get me away from going to the pool. But if I don't ask that question, I don't stimulate that mechanism, I'm in the car and on my way and in the water long before I thought about whether I wanted to go there or not, long before I stimulated the mechanism that might have gotten me to go away. So what they do is they either don't think about it, so they don't engage in that process, so the emotion doesn't get stimulated. The second thing they might do is they do think about it, but they think about it very specifically. They think about, for example, how good am I going to feel when I come home tonight and tell my spouse that I did another lesson on my typing tutor? How good am I going to feel at the end of this hour when I have another 2 pages written in the book? How good am I going to feel 30 minutes into the run when everything relaxes and I know I feel good? So the other thing people do is they self-selected a point in the activity, either at the end of it or sometime during it, when the emotional response is positive or the physical sensation is positive. So what gets them out and past that first 10 minutes that's gnarly and they don't like it is thinking about how good it feels 10 minutes into it. So that was the second one they did. And the third one is there are some people who just seem to have trained themselves to know that initiating the action is what's problematic. Like once they get started, and this is very true in human behavior, it's like once people head in a direction, they don't like changing direction. It's like once they're in the car on the way to the gym, if 10 minutes later they say, do I feel like going to the gym? It's actually harder now to turn around and go home than it is to keep going. So we found consistently people used one of those three. We also found that all people that we worked with, anytime they do something they do not want to do, how it gets done is by engaging one of those three. So they're managing the emotional and physical anticipation of a negative by just not activating the brain to trigger that mechanism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes tremendous sense, especially from an mBit perspective. Your first strategy there, as you say, bypasses the head brain function and goes straight to the gut function and just says, get going, regardless. And the second strategy is about rearranging the head brain representation so that you get a positive heart response.
Yes.
Therefore, the heart can actually then motivate the rest of the person. I say the heart brain can then engage the rest of the neural networks so that we've got a motivated response occurring. Right? And the last one, obviously, is because now you've changed the scenario that you kick the gut brain in so that it just starts taking action. And once you've got momentum going, then, as you say, the head's narrative is now, well, it's a lot easier to just keep going.
Yes. I mean, those sound like very good, representations in your language of those particular findings.
Those are excellent discoveries. Now, Stephanie, also, there's a difference between those that would have been able to anchor those responses. So it just happens. It's just a straight stimulus response where they go into effective action. However, it's another thing if it has to be done by choice or if it's desired to be done by a conscious choice at the time.
Yep.
And one of the things we're finding is the state of the autonomic nervous system makes a difference here. So we've got the two arms, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And if someone's in an overly sympathetic state, they'll go into a high stress. So as you say, maybe the head's making overwhelming images of how difficult it's going to be. They start stressing out. Or they're just too apathetic. They just don't have enough color in their pictures, so to speak, and they just can't get themselves motivated. But to be at a choice point, they need to be in a relative state of balance, somewhere between the two, where the sympathetic, parasympathetic are balanced enough that conscious functioning can come into play, and they can now start to choose, do I really want to succumb to this inaction, or do I want to choose to become someone who is the kind that can take action despite how I might feel? Have you found anything in your research that goes along those lines?
Well, I didn't look at it particularly from that angle, but what I did look at was that you're absolutely right. There are some people who just seem to be quite habituated in how they approach challenging tasks, meaning they don't have a conscious thought really about disengaging, for example, their thinking in order to get something done. They don't need to do the mental work to do that. What I found with those people was that in tracking back to their early experiences, these were learned behaviors. So almost to a T, they could all recount influential people in their significant others in their early life for whom the messages were very clear that if something was challenging or difficult, they should get to it straight away. So, for example, a kid coming home with his homework in math, not really enjoying math, the message from a parent might be, then we do our math first. We don't do anything else. We sit down and we get that done first. And so what happens is by doing that, they start to learn that there's relief in action, meaning once the action's taken, they have total relief knowing they don't have to do this again for another day or two. And that becomes in itself quite rewarding. And these are people, when we track them later in life, we find, for example, if you track most successful people, highly motivated people, they will almost all tell you they have highly ritualized starts to their day, and they always do the hard stuff in the day first. Now, if I was a kid who hated math and I came home and said to my parents, listen, I don't like my math, I don't want to do my homework, and they said, well, listen, I get it, math is tough for a lot of people, why don't you just hold that off and do the stuff you like first and do your math at the end, then the message I start to learn is if it's tough or I don't like it, I should delay. And these are the people that we find who can spend, a day, a week, a month avoiding those tasks that aren't particularly more difficult than other tasks. It's just that they don't like them. So, for example, they might not make a controversial call. And they think that by avoiding, they're alleviating the stress. But as you know and I know, the brain is still sitting there asking the question, when are we going to make the call, when are we going to make the call, still being anxious, still being nervous. And there's no relief until it's done. And I oftentimes joke in my classes, I ask the question, how many people perceive themselves to be, 11th hour wonders, the people who delay until the very last minute. And of course, I'll usually get a laugh and half the hands will go up, and I'll ask them how many of them have created a narrative or a story that convinces them they're actually better under stress, to which, of course, they all kind of blush and then crack up. Because the reality is we don't particularly perform most tasks better under stress. The body is having to handle all the stress hormones leading up to the action, which again can be weeks in length. And there is relief only when the action's taken. But people don't seem to generalize that unless it's pointed out to them, like brought to their awareness. They tend not to generalize that particular lesson. So, is there something innate in different people? I didn't find that, but I certainly found a lot of evidence that how difficult tasks were presented to them and the guidance they were given at a young age went a long way to how they continued to behave as adults.
That's very fascinating and very profound as well. How do you build that into your learning when you're actually working with students? Well,
it's interesting. From a teacher's perspective or from a methodology perspective, how it gets designed in is understanding that not only are people driven by their own emotional responses to a task, but also to emotional responses to other things in the environment around the task. Now, as a teacher, I have an opportunity to create quite a bit of what I would call positive tension around a student, meaning I can set up consequences for delaying. So, for example, I might say, I'm going to pass this article out. I'd like you to read that this evening. And what I'll get, if I just say that, what I'll get is, 30% will read it and the rest of them won't. But if I say, listen, I'm going to give you this article to read tonight, and you need to know that the first thing tomorrow morning is we're going to be talking about it. And if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, you're going to find yourself lost for the first hour, meaning there's a bit of social disapproval in not reading it. I'll get 95% compliance. So as a teacher, okay, you can picture emotions kind of as sitting on a scale. So if doing the task doesn't feel good and they're going to be compelled to not do it, my job is to create a more significant negative for not doing the task. So now all of a sudden doing the task is easier than dealing with my negative consequence, if that makes sense. Of course, it can also be that I can offer them a bigger reward for getting it done. Like, the people do like praise and recognition. And if I start demonstrating that when people get things done, they get a little smile or, they make the teacher happy, I'm also going to compel them to engage in difficult tasks simply because they get a smile or they get a tick or a thumbs up from me. So as a teacher, I can, and let's face it, all of us have had experiences in school with very difficult, challenging things where the teacher was what made the difference. We wanted to work for that teacher. We wanted to produce for that teacher, or we were scared to death of not performing for that teacher. So teachers, we used to ask the question, if you asked third graders if they wanted to do history, every third grader would say, no way. Or if you asked a third grader if they wanted to go to school, most of them would say, you're out of your mind. So we used to say, well, how come kids get their goals in education and adults don't? Well, because kids don't have any choice about this. And why they get homework done and things done is because there are massive consequences for not getting it done. Where an adult entering a learning environment, they rarely have those kind of tensions placed on them. So in my work, in my teaching, and certainly with the people who have worked with me, I take responsibility for setting up that kind of context where there is a stake and a cost involved with performance, both on a reward and on a consequence standpoint. So from that perspective, like I said, to me, it is the quintessential control that you need to have. It's one of your powers as a teacher, and it's one of the kind of arrows you have in your quiver that you can pull out. And by the way, this is in support of the adult student having come to you wanting to go somewhere. So you're not manipulating them. You're just being effective in getting your job done. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And again, also relates to the heart-brain's, one of its prime functions around relational affect, the student wanting to maintain a good relationship with the teacher.
Yes.
And how does that, do you have any thoughts on as to how that translates to things like online learning, where sometimes if there isn't a specific teacher, or even if there is, it's somewhat distanced via the technology?
Well, yeah. I spent, almost 5 years really looking at online methodology, and as an aside, this goes back to the 1980s. One of the early jobs I did was for a guy named Larry Wilson at Interactive Technologies, and the questions that we were asking then was, could you, in fact, produce media-based education that was as effective as classroom education? And, really no one had ever asked that kind of question before. And the answer to that question was you could absolutely, but you needed to essentially put the teacher, the energy of the teacher, the feature, the social, interpersonal relationship of the teacher in the box, if you will. We couldn't go very far with it in the 80s because we didn't have either means or method or content, the ability to drive content in the media until the until the advent of the internet. Once the internet came online big in the mid-90s, that's when I got fully involved in doing some tests around designing some methodology for delivery online that created the same kind of tensions that a face-to-face teacher provides. And they were very successful. Now, you have to get to, in those early days, in the mid-90s, most online learning was essentially PowerPoint online. So, we were looking at information disguised as education, and there was this idea that, if you provide it, they will come. And if you provide it, the student will engage with it. And, I worked with some of the biggest online companies in the world with their products whose attrition rates were as high as 96%. Tragically, the reality was they could sell stacks of it, but they weren't getting any completion rates. There was no learning going on. And again, that was a big motivation for me to jump in. So I designed probably 20 different courses, my own work in some of those, and then for other clients, really only with the intention of demonstrating that you could, in fact, get upwards of 97, 98% completion rates with measurable results. And again, the idea was to put the teacher in the box and to have a strong voice. As close as I can relate this to you is if you read there are models for this already, and that's, books. There are books that are written so well, that are so engaging, that create such anticipation. They kind of abide by all of the things that motivate humans to want to turn the page or go the next step or wake up tomorrow and do something. And there are books and narratives written that just compel the reader to want to keep going. And we drew a lot from that, and I drew also a lot from video game psychology. How do you get people addicted, basically, to waking up tomorrow to finding out what's going to happen next? And so most of my online courses were strongly narrative. They had an incredibly strong teacher's voice. They were parsed into small enough bits that people could wake up and, say, in a 20-minute session in the morning, grab onto the next lesson, the next thing they needed to know. Then they could go into their lived world at work. They could observe those things happening. They could experiment. And then they would come back later in the day and report on what they'd learned or what they'd noticed and what they'd done. We also always did online programs with teams of people from 10 to 20 people. So they had no obligation to be interacting, but they had a choice to follow some or all students' experiences. So we were getting lots and lots of learning going on observationally and vicariously through those interactions. And those courses could be 5-6 weeks in length, and that would be a daily interaction during the week. And again, we would have courses that would have 100% completion rate, and I don't think any course ever had lower than a 97% completion rate. So again, it was really, people woke up thinking I was sitting in their inbox, and they couldn't wait to find out what the heck I was going to ask them to do today. And once you get the narrative right, people will continue to perceive you're there, even though you wrote it 10 years ago.
That's terrific.
It was all good fun. And I was trying to break some of the myths. There were ideas like, you can't put more, you can only write a lesson on, it has to be on one page. Like there was this thing people used to say, people don't like to scroll. And I'd go, well, that just sounds like an excuse from a lazy friggin' writer. There's no reality. People will scroll if what you're doing is interesting enough to compel them to do that. So I was kind of sitting with all of these kind of prescriptive ideas for designing online courses that made absolutely no sense to me. And I used to challenge the designers to try to sit through their own courses, which of course, if you ask a buyer of an online program, have you done the program? Because I can't figure out why 90% of the people who start it won't finish it. And I'll ask if they've done it. And of course the answer is no. It's like people buying and people designing have no idea what it's like to be a human being on the other side of that screen. None. And I know what it's like to be on the other side of the screen. And I wrote from the perspective of being the student on the other side of the screen. So, I was in it I wasn't trying to make a point as much as I was trying to say there is a way. And, and that was done. It's been written about extensively. I just applied all that methodology to Cisco Systems online courses. They've had great success with that. And it's, yet it's not the primary business I'm in. Just sometimes I get either content or a demographic that I've never tested the methods with, and that it will intrigue me enough to get involved.
Yeah, I was about to ask that. I was thinking along those lines as well, because so much is the personality of what would you call them? Whoever is this so-called teacher educator on the online program.
Yeah.
So given that so much is driven by that personality of whoever it is being represented as a teacher educator on that online program, how would you do it with different demographics, different psychographics, or is it simply a matter of being very clear on your target market and your niche?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think if both you and I go back to our early days of teaching, you with Mastermind and myself with Learning to Learn and things like that. I mean, one of the things that I think fascinated people most in those programs was the broad nature of the demographic. I mean, we would have 15-year-old kids to 70-year-olds to PhDs to people who were illiterate to, office managers to CEOs. I mean, for me, what I always did was I kind of stripped the demographic down to one real simple common trait. They're all human beings, and they all have a brain and a nervous system, and it basically functions the same way. Humans are motivated in similar ways. There are real keys to motivation and learning effectiveness and managing, especially an educational process. So for me, I don't really think about trying to match up to, quote, a demographic. I don't think a CEO learns particularly differently than his PA or someone who's working out in the warehouse. They are going to be driven toward action in a very common, similar way. And in the same way that you and I could get, 100 students of that breadth of demographic from one end of a program to another, having produced the same exact results, is very much the kind of idea I've had probably since I first started teaching. I know that designers do like to put in the mix, well, this is going to, and I hear it all the time, this program is going to be delivered to the guys who work in the warehouse, and they're not going to want like this, and this. And I go, how do you know? You have no idea. Because they're coming at it from an angle of diversity And teaching and methodology should come from the angle of sameness. At least it's been working that way for me. I don't want to sound righteous about it, but it does seem to be a better play to look at what causes an organism to move toward and what causes one to move away, and find that it's going to be the same across the board. What's your thought on that? Have I lost my mind?
I don't know. I'm trying to find mine. So I think you're probably right in that. It is important to appeal to what is innate within the human, and then there are times when how that comes across has to be obviously. It's not translate. It's not the right word, but it has to fit a particular learner's filters for what they're going to respond to and not. So.
True. I'm not going to say that there aren't subtleties for sure. But because there are, and I'm trying to think of some exact examples, but it would be very rare for me to design a course that accommodated, for example, different modalities or different learning styles. Because the reality is, for me, there's a single best way to teach whatever it is you're teaching. If I'm teaching a physical skill, they're going to have to practice and engage. That means I'm going to have to understand that doing something new is going to feel in their nervous system quite uncomfortable, and it's going to feel that way for a period of time. If I'm teaching an intellectual skill, so they need new knowledge, I'm going to approach that in a way that accommodates that. I understand what's problematic and challenging and emotional, has some sort of negative emotions attached to that. I'm going to take care of that. But I would not really be someone who says, okay, I've got a bunch of why learners and I've got a bunch of how learners, and so I'm going to accommodate, I'm going to design my methodology to do that. I'm going to go, no, they're trying to learn to play the piano. There's a lot of theory and practice, and I have a single best, fastest way, most efficient way to get people to that. My job as the teacher is not to get the student to like it. It's to get them to do it, because if they do it and they get to the end, then they're going to like it. So oftentimes when teachers try to accommodate a student so that the student likes the process, they also then don't ever get the result with them, because that method isn't aligned with the task that they're trying to teach or the skill that they're trying to teach. So I've always kind of gone the opposite direction on that thinking that kind of emerged about the time you and I were coming out, which was, accommodating various learning styles. Let's face it, if you have somebody whose preference in learning is auditory, they have a preference for that, but what you're teaching them requires that they build new internal images in order to function properly with that information. It doesn't matter that they're auditory. You have to be able to say, I know you like it this way, but this is the way we're doing it. My job is to hold enough tension around you to get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. So.
Yay. Phew.
Yeah, I had a conversation once with someone many years ago, and they were saying that, isn't it true that people have different ways of learning, and that they need to find a way that suits them best? And I said, well, yes and no.
It depends.
It absolutely depends. If they kind of just want to learn whatever they care to learn that fits their particular style, then great. Yes. But if they actually want to learn something specific, then there are definitely different strategies, internal strategies that require you to do it a particular way if you want to do it best. So.
Absolutely, Marvin. No question about it. And I always saw my role with students in getting them to expand their capabilities in all the modalities, and to, again, you can't make a learner feel comfortable in a situation that's new and is uncomfortable. What you can do is have them feel uncomfortable and not have that cause them to quit. You can have them feel uncomfortable recognizing that's a natural way for them to feel for a period of time. And, when I used to look at things like, the learning styles, models, etc., to me, the goal seemed to be getting people to feel, or to, if not comfortable, then certainly to accommodate that there are times when they need to know why, and there are times when they need to focus on what. There are times when they need to be actively experimenting, and times they need to be in practice. So it was to kind of expand their confidence, I guess, if you will, in engaging in all of those kinds of activities for the well-roundedness of the learning they were doing, and to not be deferring to their preference. But like you said, it is a choice. If you want to only focus on what you like doing, and is preferred, then it's, there's still stacks you can learn if all you ever want to do is read about it. So you can become a master at pianos. You just can't learn to play the piano if you're going to stick to your own preference of reading. And this is something I had to learn because, coming through my 20s, I had really strong preferences and real strong move-aways from certain types of activities. My shyness was just so high in some activities that, I was really ineffective. And so a lot of my mid-20s, late 20s was learning how to feel more confident being a learner, engaging in things that I didn't like doing, like practicing in front of a teacher or playing or performing in front of other students. These are things that were highly problematic for me. And so, from that experience, I can relate to my students and I can support them and accommodate that with kind of stories and narratives of those kind of experiences.
I've got a question I'd like to ask that's been stimulated by what you said earlier, which was you were talking about people in terms of motivating themselves to learn. They procrastinate. They're still left with this stress state. And from a sympathetic dominant stress state, people aren't necessarily an optimally functioning state or an optimal learning state. So I was just wondering, in terms of the conversation around facilitating your autonomic nervous system, whether you're in a stressed or a sympathetic state, whether you're in a coherent state, etc. In terms of designing learning programs, do you, as a teacher, build in any processes to get your students into what you believe will be the optimal state for that learning experience, or do you just let them carry whatever state it is? And
that's a great question. No, I mean, as Marvin would probably know from the past, I'm a firm believer in preparing students for the experience they're about to have. And in that preparation is making quite explicit the nature of what it is they are about to engage in and the possible, not the absolute, but the possible reactions they're going to have to that. And should they be of a type that's negative, what it is I would like them to do about that, or how it is I want them to perceive that. So that my students, for example, if they head off into something that's, especially, for example, teaching guitar, that was a really big one. For the first 6 months, they're just terrible at it. It doesn't matter what you do. They're just really bad. You can't make them good quickly. And so, the preparation for them was to call that, if you will, was always to kind of lift the lid on the lived reality of the learning experience, such that when they would then experience it, they could go, she knows that I know that she knows that I know that this was really bad. And I trust that she says it's going to be like this for 3 months. And if I stick with it for 3 months, that will go away. So for me, it's always been, I can't put them in a state that's going to make them feel better about something that's going to make them feel bad. That's just not tenable. But what I can do is get them to understand what the bad is, that the bad is normal and natural, that everyone who ever tried to learn this skill felt that way in the beginning, and that the way through it is to persist with it, and that I'm there with them through that whole process. And because I can give them small wins, along the way, let them know that I can, for example, set them up in an exercise where in the beginning it feels awful, and with a commitment that within 30 minutes they'll relax into it and it will start to feel better. So when they do, so they can give me 30 minutes of feeling terrible, and they do that. And at the end of 30 minutes, when they start to relax and feel better, they start also then to build trust that I'm telling the truth about these things. And over time, I can start to get them to persist for longer and longer periods in that process. But of course, I can't lie to them. And I have to know what I'm talking about with that. And I have to pick it. I mean, if they wake up, if they go 30 minutes and it still feels that terrible, they're just never going to believe me again. I sound like one of those people going, yay, we're having fun, aren't we? This was good. I got half the students in their head going, no, this isn't fun at all. I'm not getting this at all. So yes, I'm paying attention to it in the sense that I'm aware. I don't even need to know who specifically in the room is feeling it. I just know some of them are going to feel it. And let's put it this way. If I do a setup projecting that and no one feels it, well, everyone in the room thinks someone else is feeling it. So they give me permission to do that. And for the person who's feeling bad, they feel okay because now they know they're not the only one, even if they are. It's just kind of, like I said, this all harks back, Marvin, to, what you and I were doing in the very early days with language and with setups and preparation for students, especially the teenagers. I mean, look what we had to do to get them to engage.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that was just, that was really, really difficult process work. And it had to be done kind of in a really authentic way based on experience, knowing what the experience was like in the skin of, a large variety of humanity and how they might feel and what to do about it if they did. And it seems to work.
One of the things that comes to mind in what you're saying there is two mBit axioms, heuristics. So one is that the heart leads, that you can best lead people through aligning their three brains by accessing the heart first, and the prime function of connection of relational affect. So it sounds to me like what you're saying that would facilitate state, but you do it using the fact that you're effectively entraining the room through the connection with yourself. It's not necessarily like getting the focus on the values of how good they'll feel at the end, etc., so much as their trust of you once you've entrained them at a connection level. They know they can trust you, go on that journey, and you will take them even through some places where they're not going to feel too good, but that you'll get them to the place where they will feel good and they will have learnt.
Listen, I think that's very true. And, I used to have a lot of conflict around how much, wasn't so much internal conflict, but there was a conflict in, the notion of causing people to be independent learners and be able to manage this kind of stuff on their own. I just found that in the early stages, they need so much evidence to counter kind of the inner world that they've made up, most of which is that, what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they like, what they're not. Most people have just never had any training that's woken them up to have an awareness of their process, such that they can manage it. And so I always felt that I needed to take a lot of responsibility for that in the front end of something I was doing. And then slowly over time, as they started to recognize their own internal signals and symptoms, and had then strategies to override them, then of course you can slowly start to create independence in them. But yes, I would have been accused a lot by some of my, best friends and colleagues for taking on more responsibility than they would have. There was a big movement in creating independent learners, but I just found, how do you be independent if you don't know what the hell you're doing? Where people, for example, they teach something and then let students sit around and talk about it and teach each other. And I'd go, how are they going to teach each other? They don't know anything. People used to say, but you don't let your students talk to each other. Yeah, because they don't know what they're talking about. But later when they do, and they've had experiences and they can come back and share them and have a common language to describe the things they're experiencing so they can inform each other, fine, let them loose. But yeah, I used to have some pretty outrageously fun, conversations and debates with, like I said, very, very good teachers and very big academics in this area about this very thing. And I don't know there's a right way. I just know that it's the only way I know how to go about it for the kind of outcomes I was trying to achieve. And evidence being, I did not create a lot of, mini Stephanies, and I did not create a network of people who follow me. And I would say most people believe that they came, they got it, they learned to use it, and then they went off and did it, and they didn't need to think about me after that. So, I always felt pretty good that that was the evidence for me that I wasn't creating little minions of dependence.
Yeah, the heart leads and not the heart sticks.
Yeah, no, I'm not sticking.
One last one, maybe. So, Stephanie, there's just so many things that you've shared with us today that have just been sensational. Are any tips or advice, anything you can leave professional educators with, whether it's teachers, trainers, whoever it might be, just some key things to take away?
I'm remembering the talk we did in Hawaii on spontaneity. I don't know if your audience knows that, but Marvin and I did a lecture, and the topic was spontaneity. We met at 4 a.m. to plan for it. Not knowing we're not very spontaneous. But we got on stage, and Marvin's opening line or near opening line was to look at me and say, we got up early this morning to talk about this, and Steph and I came up with 3 keys to spontaneity, and Steph's going to tell you what they are. I don't have a bloody clue what he was talking about. So that was a great challenge, and we did survive by getting the audience to answer those for us. And I don't think they were ever the wiser for that. But so this is a bit like that. Keys for educators, my goodness, off the top of my head, I think certainly the big key for me that's made a huge difference is to continuously engage in various learning processes. Like, I don't want to forget what it's like to be the learner. I don't want to forget what it's like to sit in a class with a boring teacher. I don't want to forget what it's like to be in a new learning process where I feel like my shoes are on the wrong feet, a new physical skill. I found every year I'm engaging in some way in learning something new being confronted with different teaching methods and different teachers. And from those, I really gain a lot about what works, what doesn't, what I want to be like, what I don't want to be like. It reinforces the kind of lived experience my students have. So when I'm standing in front of them asking them to do something, I'm not I'm not thinking about them. I'm not thinking, geez, well, I'm just going to throw them into this task and they're not going to feel anything. Maybe that's the point I want to make, is it keeps reminding me that my students are having every second of the day an emotional response to what it is I'm asking them to do. And that emotional response is going to either move them toward being effective and open to doing what I'm asking, or is going to cause them to shut down and kind of try to protect themselves. And so for me, all teachers, I think, should somehow be engaged in some sort of experience where they are the learner. And the more far field or far from, what you think you are, the better. It's be it go do ballroom dancing or learn rock climbing or go back and do, some courses over at the university or jump online and do something. It's been really interesting dealing with some members in the corporate sector who are a bit older now, and just to watch them curl their lip every time the word Facebook is mentioned. And I go, how can you possibly be relating to people who are younger for whom they gain so much value out of media, out of social media? It's driving kind of how they're shaping their world and how they're thinking. And so for someone who's older to just kind of out of hand say, well, it's a bunch of crap and it's not worth anything is nuts. If, I would say go spend a year engaging with it, find out what the values are so you can relate to the people who are coming up behind us. Now, I listened to this gal from a big company, one of the biggest in the world. She's one of their global leaders, stand up, and she said to the audience, she said, if you are not, as business people, on Twitter following your clients, you don't have a bloody clue what's going on out there. And you could just see people's eyes rolling in the back of their head going up, they feel righteous and sanctimonious saying, I don't use Twitter. So, and yet they're totally missing the whole point of what these things are about. So for me, that would be my number one thing, I think, is continuously engage as a learner and feel what it feels like and recognize when you teach, that's what you cause people to feel. And from that, you have empathy. And from that, you won't do to others the bad things that get done to you. And you'll take care of people better in the process. I think if people did that, then my other 10 tips will all be self-evident. Hey, listen, this has been good. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Steph.
Thanks,
All right,
Steph. Brilliant.